So basically, my argument will be presented like this. I think that worldviews are what we all have. We all function on the basis of three basic philosophic approaches to life that are usually boiled down to metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology. So these three branches of philosophy historically have been what makes up what we could call a worldview, at least in Western philosophy. I would say that I believe, and I would argue that each one of these branches is intertwined with the other. So, for example, if I argue for something in the realm of epistemology, if I argue that a belief is true, typically what goes along with that is also an assumption about ethics and moral claims, moral judgments, that one ought to follow what is true. Now, one could disagree with that conceivably, but I'm going to argue that I think they're all intertwined. Similarly, if I were to say that we know that something is the case, it also tends to imply or necessitate certain beliefs about metaphysics, claims about what's real, what's not real, what can be or what can't be. So these three aspects of a worldview, I would say, are in a sense transcendental categories, or they at least utilize a lot of transcendental categories. Transcendental categories would be things like the principle of induction, the laws of logic, the past, identity over time, the self, the regularity that we find in nature. These are not subjects that are the immediate purview of empirical sense data or empirical science. They're related to empirical science. For example, the principle of induction, that the future will be like the past, that there's regularity in logic, that there's regularity, and that there's a flow, you could say, to the scientific method. For example, if you study philosophy of science, you'll know that there's actually a logical process that's assumed in the process of doing the scientific method. So from reasoning on the basis of hypothesis to what the data supports towards a conclusion, for example, it presupposes that one ought to be true in this process if one wants to obtain the most true conclusions in this process. It presupposes the logic that one step in this process should follow another step. And it also presupposes all kinds of other things, like that words have meaning, regularity, etc., that objects have a sort of uniformity to them over time. That's, I would say, is all presupposed in the scientific process itself. Numbers would be presupposed in this process. And these are all, I think, things that are immaterial, invariant, they're conceptual, and they're abstract. Now, I think that because something is presupposed in the scientific methodology doesn't necessarily mean that in other words, what I'm saying, we don't necessarily prove everything in the same way, right? So in other words, something that is assumed, it's a category like that, a law of logic or something, that's utilized in the scientific method is in a way more properly basic, more fundamental than even the scientific method itself. So even though the scientific method doesn't have the laws of logic under its immediate purview, it still assumes laws of logic and that regularity that cannot be proven in terms of empirical sense data. So if one were to adopt a kind of naive empiricist view, a kind of logical positivism, what we end up with is the inability to understand or to justify the belief in the principle of induction, the regularity of nature, that the future will be like the past. Now, one could say conceivably that they don't think that we have to justify it or that we can't justify it, but I think that at that point we would be being arbitrary and we would be believing in and admitting things that we don't have any sort of justification for. And I'm speaking here of a kind of specific philosophic justification here in terms of warranted beliefs, in terms of justifying true beliefs, et cetera. The way history of philosophy in the West has typically justified propositions and beliefs. I would say that we would be relying on things that are immaterial that we can't justify. And so the way that I move from that to God is to say that there are actually a whole bunch of things in all of our lives that we assume that are not strictly speaking physical, not strictly speaking, quote, pragmatic, because from what I gather from Matt's worldview, he tends to have a very sort of pragmatic approach. There's all these types of things that are not immediately justified or known by sense data or basic empiricism, or in what's in history of philosophy called naive empiricism. So what I would say is that if I were Matt, if I wanted to be a consistent skeptic, I would go the route of David Hume and be a skeptic all the way. And to be a skeptic all the way would be to admit ultimately that no, there's not a justification for induction, for the regularity that we see in nature, and thus there's no justification epistemically, logically, in terms of rationality, reason, logic, etc., for the scientific method itself. Now we can fast forward all the way up to modern logicians like Bertrand Russell or William Van Orman Quine. Russell and Quine also continued this idea of saying that there's not really a justification if you're a basic empiricist for these ideas. They just have to be kind of a given. We can treat them like they are, but we can't coherently give a basis or a justification for them. So to me, that's kind of an admission of the intellectual bankruptcy of this kind of logical positivist position. So you have all these kinds of things that are different from just physical material, physicalism, like laws of logic, like numbers, like number theory, like Mandelbrot sets, right? Very, very elaborate mathematical sort of equations that many philosophers and mathematicians, somebody like Roger Penrose, and I'm just bringing this forth as a testament, not a proof, just as an expert testament. You know, Penrose says that when I looked into the advanced mathematics of Penrose tiling, he said it looked to me like we're actually discovering these mathematical principles, not socially constructing them. So if you know about fractals, you know about Mandelbrot sets, you know they're very elaborate, right? They're not something that could just be a social construct. They're actual mental discoveries. So the point is that if that's the case, then I don't think it's at all irrational to believe that all of these different kinds of categories or transcendental preconditions could be explained perfectly in a worldview where God exists, and particularly the Christian view. So I'm here to defend Orthodox Christianity, not Southern Baptist theology, not the fundamentalist stuff, not Roman Catholicism or any of the other views. I have a very specific view and argument from Orthodox Christology and theology. So when we have that conception of God, God as a divine mind, omnipotent, omnipresent, et cetera, what we then see is that reality has its grounding and its basis in the mind of God. So quite literally, everything that exists has a logoi or a logi, an exemplar as it's called in the West. This is kind of like Platonism, but I want to be very precise because we're not Platonists. But we do believe that the essences and the universals that exist are ultimately grounded in the mind of God. And that makes perfect sense. That makes sense why there's regularity in nature, because of divine providence, because everything that exists is, in a sense, grounded in the mind of God. Thus, truth has more than just a pragmatic function. It actually is a transcendent quality. Truth is actually objective. It's not just a social construct. It's actually a reflection of the mind of God. And specifically, I would argue that if we got into the nitty-gritty of it, it would be a defense of the Orthodox view of God, right? Getting down to the point of the one and the many. For example, this is a classic problem in the history of Western philosophy. The one and the many problem is solved by our doctrine of the Trinity, and more specifically by the Logos, Christ, and the Logi, right? The rational principles that are operant in nature. Now, it's true that we could remove all that. We could just say, well, none of that's true. I don't buy any of that. Those are a bunch of logical crazy leaps. And I just think that what exists out there is matter in motion. I know Matt's heard this argument many times. I'm not going to rehash all the sort of classic presuppositionalists, quote unquote, that he's debated, because I think my argument is a little more precise, a little more fleshed out, better argued, hopefully. And that is that all of these different transcendental categories, if you were to sort of bundle them into a big pile, they make perfect sense in a world created by God, in a world that unfortunately is fallen, but nevertheless still reflects to a degree the truth about God. If we're made in the image of God, we understand how there's dignity. If we are made in the image of God, we have the ability to know objective truth, right? God's world is regular. It operates on principles of regularity. If the mind of God is the basis of all reality, we have a basis for these really abstract and obtuse mathematical principles that we know are real, that are not, strictly speaking, physical. So all of these kinds of things, right? Ethics, epistemology, metaphysics, they make perfect sense in a worldview where our God exists and the kind of God that we argue for. In a worldview where we have pure materialism, pure pragmatism, random chance, random chaos, there's nothing like invariant, immaterial, conceptual, law-like things. Where are they? What are they? They're just social constructs. Now, I don't know if that's Matt's opinion or view, but I have heard him say in previous discussions and talks that he doesn't think that there is a justification, so to speak, for logical laws, mathematical principles, these sort of abstract conceptual things. He thinks that they're just kind of things that we just use and they work. But that
30 seconds.
But that would be, I would say, to be arbitrary. And when it comes to debate, we're presupposing universal categories and laws, and that doesn't allow us to be arbitrary.
All right. Thank you, Jay. Excellent. Well done. It was right on time. And over to Matt now. Let me reset our timer here. Okay, Matt, over to you.
Hi. Yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me. I will say I'm not convinced that I actually heard an argument in all of that.
So first he asked for a syllogism. So I think I can oblige this to a degree and say that, I could state it like this. There are many transcendental categories. I'll list some of the ones that I think are strong, and I don't mind that Matt included the idea of truth. I don't have a problem including truth. There's plenty, actually. It's just that I was just kind of going off the top of my head and listing some. But you could say something like identity of objects over time. You could say value judgments. You could say interpretive frameworks. You could say the problem of the one and the many. You could say meaning in language. You could say words themselves. You could say temporal spatial relations. You could say the past. You could say numbers. You could say the idea of causality. You could say the idea of telos, rights, freedom. All of these could be bundled together. If we were to discuss those things, they're presupposed not just in the process of scientific methodology, which I was kind of focusing on in the opening statement, but in life in general, right? I mean, throughout life, we assume these kinds of things all throughout. We assume the existence of a self, right? The self, however, is not something, obviously, that is empirically verifiable. We kind of assume it in the process of arguing for it or against it. Now, I'm not saying that people that argue about it or that there might not be some attempt to scientifically investigate the notion of a self, but even if you were to find a pineal gland where you thought something, like Descartes, where the soul or the self or mind or whatever was housed or whatever, there's still a distinction, I would argue, between brain and mind, in my view. Now, that's why I'm saying that when we talk about reasoning, when we talk about logic, when we talk about all these different categories, I think we're talking about things that are outside the purview of mere sense data and sense experience. That doesn't mean that they don't have any connection to material sense data and sense experience. They're interrelated, but they're not identical. So I want to say that I don't think we have to fall into like an either or unless we presuppose materialism. I think if we did presuppose materialism, it would be self-contradictory. So the argument specifically in terms of syllogism is that all of these transcendental categories, if they are to be made coherent and sensible, and I do believe in a coherentist view of truth and justifying claims, not a classical foundationalist type of view in terms of epistemology. So I'm going to be arguing for that school of thought. I would say that we would justify them in terms of their coherence in the worldview in which there is a God that's presented according to Orthodox Christianity. So that's the syllogism, if you want a boiled down version of it. And that's a positive statement of the argument that he's justified on the basis of being the grounds and the coherence, if you will, what strings all these many pearls of transcendentals together on a golden string, if you will, a pearl necklace, is God himself. God is the personal one who does this, and because he's personal and not an immaterial abstract force like a law of logic or gravity or the way the Greeks thought of God as thought thinking itself or some impersonal force, he's actually personal. That then makes reality at a fundamental level personal and not dead matter. It's not meaningless matter out there. It's actually fundamentally at the very fabric and structure, at subatomic level, I would argue, a personal God that's there, that's present, that's staring us in the face in every action of predication and every act in the world, even in the midst of evil actions. If we think about the problem of evil, I would argue that presupposes some standard by which we judge good and evil. Now, Matt's response was that can we even attain to this truth? He's not convinced that we can, and so he went on to sort of explicate that as I wrote down what he was saying. I don't want to misrepresent him, that just because we believe that we sort of constructed justifications for things in an abstract way doesn't necessarily mean that it perhaps matches up to the external world. Maybe that we just believe that we've attained justifications, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is, right? So we can't move to this abstracted realm into the realm of the here and the now out there in the world. I could, to a degree, concede that, except that I don't think that that's what my argument was or was intended to be. I wasn't trying to argue that just because we can find a rational justification that it necessarily means that everything in the world conforms to a purely mental structure, because I'm not just trying to map the external world with mathematics or something like that. I'm actually looking at something that's even more fundamental, in my view, than numbers or mathematics. I would argue that in our system, yes, God is the ultimate presupposition. So Matt was correct to say that it sounds like Jay's presupposing the existence of God, and yes, I am. And I know that Matt's debated presuppositions before. I don't think they were very good presenters of that argument. But yes, in effect, because I believe in that sort of coherentist view of truth and of the world, it's impossible for me not to have some final circular authority that I appeal to in my belief, in my system, my worldview. It is ultimately going to be God, and that's not inconsistent with the system or the philosophy that I'm promoting, right? Coherentism, not classical foundationalism, which out of the Enlightenment actually leads to that kind of atheist materialist perspective, I would say. But in fact, there's nothing logically wrong or incoherent by saying that God is the ultimate foundation in my worldview, and that I am presupposing it, and that I'm comparing what I presuppose to Matt's presuppositions. Matt's presuppositions are very pragmatic, as I said. They're skeptical and they're pragmatic, and I understand that. I don't necessarily have a problem with it. I would just enjoin Matt to be more consistent if he's going to go that route, and go the route of Hume and go ahead and say that truth can't be justified. Induction can't be justified. And not only can it not be justified, we have to utilize all these things that don't make sense on our worldview. So I wasn't just throwing out names of Russell and William Van Orrin Quine to be fancy or whatever, but I'm actually making a specific point about the fact that Russell and Quine, all the way back to Hume, there's been a consistent pattern amongst the empiricists, the pragmatic tradition, to say there's not a rational logical justification for these things that we use in an empiricist worldview. And if there's not, then we don't really have a reason or a basis to go into debate. I'm not saying that you can't debate. I'm glad that you did. But on the grounds of logic, on the grounds of debate, which I think presupposes logic and truth, as you talked about, we don't really have the grounds to debate itself, right? So debate presupposes some common notion of truth. It presupposes the ability to communicate truths that are not merely material. I mean, I'm speaking words that have meaning, that are conceptual in some way, that go beyond just the vocal cords and just the electricity, that actually convey information. If we look at information science suggests that we don't find information, meaningful information, being transferred anywhere in the world that's not from a mind. So the argument that I made was that even more fundamental than numbers or the concept of information or words is all of these transcendental categories that are presupposed in communication, in life, in logic, in ethics, and whatever. And they make sense in a paradigm, in a complete worldview where we have the kind of God that we believe in. That is the argument. Now, one could conceivably say, I don't accept transcendental arguments. I don't believe that they're a valid form of logic. Well, one could do that, but I think that would lead to, again, more fundamental self-contradictory positions that are ultimately sort of destructive to philosophy as a whole. I mean, I kind of appreciate that Matt was almost hinting maybe there could be some sort of solipsism or something like that. And I think that if one were to go down the logical positivist Humean route, that would be the consistent way to go. You would kind of be led to that, we live in the Matrix kind of view, like Neo or something, right? That this is just sort of a projection of my subconscious, of my mind, because many in the empiricist tradition actually did go down that way. They went down that route by saying that, if we're going to talk about justifying our beliefs, being rational, giving a coherent account of our beliefs, we can't really prove the existence of the past. Not only can we not do that, we can't justify induction, the principal belief that the future will be like the past. We can't really justify the self. I mean, we have maybe a bundle of memories, but that doesn't necessarily equate to a, quote, self, that there's a transcendental unity of a self that sort of is underlying all these perceptions, right? All these the sense data that comes to us from our from empirical experiences. If we can't justify those things, then some of them went in this route of a kind of radical solipsism. And they said, the only thing that we can know is what's immediately presented to our senses. And even that, we can't even know if that's coming to us from an external world. It's just perhaps something that our mind is presenting to our senses, right? This would be eventually the debate that's called indirect realism. And if you go the route of indirect realism, then you don't even have a basis for an external world. And belief in the external world actually is a transcendental category, transcendental truth, I would argue, as all these other things that I listed are. Now, if we're at that point in our philosophy, and I don't fault Matt for going perhaps into and exploring the realms of where these ideas lead, I think what they show us is that when we don't have the presupposition of God, and when we don't start with that, we're inevitably led down these paths to dead ends in philosophy, total contradictions. And for example, if one were to say, well, maybe solipsism isn't a contradiction. Maybe everything is just a phenomena of my mind. if we were to go to that route, then we would be led to the conclusion that everything that's
30
that's
seconds.
happening is essentially, in some sense, illusory or just a figment, a phenomena of passing ghost, you could say. And if that was the case, then my coming to know the truth of solipsism would also be part of the solipsist maze and mirror, and it would be self-contradictory.